Okay, guys, this is the sixth lecture on Newman, and it is about the illative sense. I will start right away since I think this could be a long one. So here is my PowerPoint. And again, we're talking about the illative sense or achieving certitude in concrete matters. Okay, this concerns chiefly chapter 8 and 9. And in fact, in this presentation, I give quotes only from chapter 8. Chapter 9, which the title is specifically about the illative sense, Newman says is just more fully explaining the ideas that he's given in the previous chapter about informal inference. So the task that Newman set out for himself in these chapters is the following. Deduction, so formal logic or formal inference, is by its nature always conditional. Inferential exercises as such always must be conditional. Well, that is, they're conditioned upon the premises of the argument. So again, an inference is by nature something that offers only a conditional assent because you are always conditioning your conclusion upon the truth of the premises. So by its nature, inference has this trouble about it. And nevertheless, we want to achieve certitude in our conclusions. And so how is it that we go about doing that? And is formal logic alone enough for it? Newman says we can be justified in the unconditional act of assent. So he's certainly not a skeptic. He's not somebody who notices the weaknesses of formal logic or the insufficiencies of formal logic and therefore concludes that, oh, well, we can't know anything at all. No, he says we can be justified. So the task is, how do we go from a conditional act to an unconditional one? How do we follow reasoning, inferential reasoning, such that we do eventually, by some means, go from a conditional assent to an unconditional assent? What else is helping us, if it's not just formal logic, to make that pass? Newman notes in this chapter that there is this desire in all of us as modern men and women for a kind of certainty that is ultimately impersonal. Impersonal in the sense that the truth of the matter, the achievement of certainty, doesn't depend upon any personal gift, but on an impersonal process of rules that we can just follow. And if we follow them faithfully, then we'll get the truth of the matter. Here is a quotation from him expressing this. So he says, what we desiderate, or desire, is something which may supersede the need of personal gifts by a far-reaching and infallible rule. Let then our symbols be words. Let all thought be arrested and embodied in words. Let language have a monopoly of thought, and thought go for only so much as it can show itself to be worth in language. Let the authority of nature, common sense, experience, genius go for nothing. Ratiocination, thus restricted and put into grooves, is what I have called inference, and the science, which is its regulating principle, is logic. This is an expression of the Cartesian ideal. Doubt everything that comes from your subjectivity, your senses, and so forth. Begin only with what is clear and distinct, what is perfectly contained in the words of your argument. That's a very Cartesian way to begin, and it's safe to say that all of our prejudices as modern men and women think of certainty as something achieved more or less by such a process. That is, by bracketing our subjectivity, bracketing our personal gifts, bracketing our experience, bracketing whatever genius we might have, and entrusting ourselves to clear and distinct ideas and a pure process of rules that will just click out by dominoes the ineluctable conclusions. So that's the modern desire, and Newman thinks that ultimately that doesn't work, and for various reasons. One is that we have a problem with our premises, or simply with the propositions Where am I going to put myself here? Oh, shucks. I made these things too big. Okay. We have a problem with our premises or with the very propositions of which any syllogism is composed. So here's a long quotation. The concrete matter of propositions is a constant source of trouble to syllogistic reasoning, as marring the simplicity and perfection of its process. Words which denote things, so the words which denote things, have innumerable implications. But in inferential exercises, it is the very triumph of that clearness and hardness of head, which is the characteristic talent for the art, to have stripped them of all these connatural senses, to have drained them of that depth and breadth of associations which constitute their poetry, their rhetoric, and their historical life, so that it may stand for just one unreal aspect of the concrete thing to which it properly belongs, for a relation, a generalization, or other abstraction, for a notion neatly turned out of the laboratory of the mind and sufficiently tame and subdued because existing only in a definition. Newman's contention here, if I were to express it in an image, is that the words we use in deductive logic are something like cookie cutters. So here you have reality, which is the dough, and you see how this reality of a circle here is connected to, so many other implications surrounding it. But when we want to use something for deductive logic, we need a very clear and distinct idea, something that doesn't have loose ends and associations complicating our idea of it. And so we impose upon it a very clear definition, a very clear mark, cut it out of reality, and now it exists only cut off from the concrete real as an abstraction or something like that. So for example, if you think again of the very simple syllogism, Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates is mortal, it follows very, very clearly only if we have a very clear and distinct idea of what we mean by Socrates and man. And that's, is the statement still true even though Socrates is dead, for example? Socrates is mortal. That verb is in the present tense. Is Socrates still around to be mortal? When we say Socrates is a man, we have to be very, very clear that we're talking about a human being, Socrates, and not like a statue or a painting or an image or something like that. The same thing with man. When we talk about man, what are we talking about? A human being or a statue? So in order to really make the conclusion follow from the premises, you see how we have to really hone and chop off all other associations that the word might have. And Newman's contention is that when we do that, we are ever more talking about some unreal thing. We're talking about just an aspect or a slice. Okay, moving on. Very similar point here. Are the notions that are serviceable for deductive inference like Procrustean beds to the real things from which they're abstracted. So you may know that myth about Procrusteus, how he would, in order to help people fit into their beds, he would either chop off their legs, which reached over the bed, or stretch out their bodies if they were too short in order to make them fit the bed. Newman says that inference, because of this and other reasons, succeeds partly, but it also fails. So I think insofar as it leads to true conclusions. He says, I think inference will be found partly to succeed and partly to fail. Succeeding so far as words can in fact be found for representing the countless varieties and subtleties of human thought. Failing on account of the fallacy of the original assumption, namely that whatever can be thought can be adequately expressed in words. So insofar as words can, in fact, carry something true about reality, then we can make valid conclusions, valid deductions. But if we assume that all that can be thought, all that can be true is going to be sufficiently expressed in a notion, then we have, then inference won't work, because reality is infinitely more rich than what can be captured in our words, and that's going to leave a gap that will frustrate the deduction, because the meaning of the word could have other associations which might make that conclusion not follow in a given case. We'll see something like that in a moment. So here is, I think, a good example to make the point about how, because of the vagaries of words, we can have problems in our conclusions, but also because of the fact that when we're dealing with abstractions, we reach conclusions only about other abstractions. We cannot turn these syllogisms onto an argument about particulars. For example, Elijah was a man. All men die. Elijah died. It seems to follow ineluctably. However, this now is a conclusion about a particular man. This is a conclusion about a concrete matter. And we'll see in a moment that this syllogism isn't quite as neat as we would like it if we're wanting to trust ourselves to syllogistic thought to be our guide toward certainty. Newman contends that abstract can only conduct or only lead to abstract, but what we have need to attain by our reasonings is to what is concrete. And the margin between the abstract conclusions of the science and the concrete facts which we wish to ascertain will be found to reduce the force of the inferential method from demonstration to the mere determination of the probable, such that Elijah shows us that, well, shucks, he didn't exactly die. If you trust the Old Testament, he was carried off well and alive by a fiery chariot. So this syllogism at best leads us only to a determination of what's really probable. Elijah was a man. All men die? Well, all men die. I mean, every man I've heard of has died, except for Elijah. And so there is, no reason to say that because one thing happened a million times, it's going to happen the 1,000,001st time. That's not a certain conclusion by any means. Certainly is an indication of what's probable, but you cannot allow the probable to determine the certain if this is all that we're allowing ourselves, namely the formal logic and its play on abstract ideas, because concrete matters can just turn out differently than in ways that our clear ideas couldn't expect. As Newman says, oh, good, a spot for me here. So as Newman says, a law is not a fact, but a notion. All men die. Therefore, Elijah died. But he has not died and did not die. He was an exception to the general law of humanity. So far, he did not come under that law, but under the law, so to say, of Elijah. It was the peculiarity of his individuality that he left the world without dying. What right have we to subject the person of Elijah to the scientific notion of an abstract humanity, which we have formed without asking his leave? Why must the tyrant majority create a rule for his individual history? You hear here some resonances of a very powerful emphasis that Newman makes on the particular. He says that we should not sacrifice the particular to the universal. The particular is to be a measure of the universal. It's very important here to recognize that Newman doesn't go to an extreme where he denies the reality of universals. He doesn't deny the reality of natures and things like that. His contention is to always just be careful lest you think hubristically that you really know that nature in its fullness, or that there can't be other conditions that might surprise what you thought was the nature. So Newman would say that formal inference or logic is loose at both ends, and therefore not the sure guarantor of truth in concrete matters. It is insufficient for assent, for certitude. He says specifically, there are two reasons why, when employed upon questions of fact, inference can conclude only probabilities. First, because its premises are assumed, not proved. So all that goes into Socrates is a man, that assumption. He's not a robot, he's not a statue, that is a real man, okay. And also all that I mean by man, I'm taking into my assumption, limiting, cutting off other aspects that won't enter into my idea of what it means to be a man. So the premises are assumed, not proved. And secondly, the conclusions are abstract and not concrete. What you reach by virtue of abstract ideas is just an abstract conclusion, which doesn't say something demonstrative about the concrete world. It could say something very probable if your notions and assumptions and ideas are genuine abstractions from reality, if they're helpful approximations of the natures of things and so forth, then you can get to something that's probable. But from an abstract to an abstract, you cannot get to a concrete. And therefore, at best, it's just going to lead you to a probable conclusion, not a demonstrative conclusion. So logic, its chain of conclusions hangs loose, Newman says, at both ends. Both the point from which the proof should start and the points at which it should arrive are beyond its reach. It comes short both of first principles and of concrete issues. We need a different power in order to be confident in the premises, in order to be confident in our notions, in order to make inferences about concrete things. Formal logic, dealing as it does with abstract notions, doesn't do the job. So, how do we become certain of concrete matters? Well, Newman says it's plain that formal logical sequence is not in fact the method by which we are enabled to become certain of what is concrete. And it is equally plain, he says, from what has already been suggested, what the real and necessary method is. What is that method, dear Newman? It is the accumulation of probabilities, independent of each other, arising out of the nature and circumstances of the particular case which is under review. Probabilities too fine to avail separately, too subtle and circuitous to be convertible into syllogisms, too numerous and various for such conversion, even were they convertible. He gives several examples in the chapter. One is about the insularity of England. So the conclusion that England is an island is not something that we know by formal logic alone. It is not the conclusion that comes after a demonstration. And yet it is something, he says, that we're all certain of. Why? Well, gosh, my teacher told me so, the maps told me so, the books told me so. I went and I saw the ocean both on the east and the west side. I've never been to the north, but my grandma went and she told me it was pretty there. I went down to the south fishing once with my uncle, so I've seen 4 different cardinal points of the island. I suppose there could be some kind of land bridge over to Scandinavia, but nobody's told me about it. Everyone says it's not there. All kinds of testimonies and stories from history and eyewitnesses and personal experiences, all of these things are arguments leading to the very probable conclusion that England is in fact an island. And for Newman, we can have a certainty in that because of all of these probable arguments. It's not something that is you could say impersonal. It definitely depends upon the judgment of the person who says, okay, I've seen enough evidence. It would be unreasonable of me to think that all of the history books and all of the witnesses and all of the maps are a big sham or a scheme against me to make me look like an idiot. That would be the unreasonable thing. And as much as I know anything, I'm certain that England is an island. So we can get to that point where the mature, expert, experienced mind can achieve certitude about such things. And Newman says, well, certainly we base our lives on such conclusions and so many more. This means that certitude is the quality first of a mind and not of a conclusion in itself. Certainty is something we ascribe to a conclusion based upon the certitude that we have of it. It follows that what to one intellect is a proof is not necessarily so to another, and that the certainty of a proposition does properly consist in the certitude of the mind which contemplates it. Thus, Newman says, when we are reasoning in the concrete, we must see that certitude is the result of arguments which, taken in the letter and not in their full implicit sense, are but probabilities. That's important, because Newman is not saying that we just add up on a calculator the probabilities of the different arguments and therefore have just a really, 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 really probable argument. He's saying we get to certainty. We do get to certainty, and it's not on the basis of the probable arguments in their letter. See, again, taken in the letter and not in their full implicit sense are but probabilities. Newman will say that the experienced mind can see can reach certainty, can make that jump, not on the basis of the probable arguments in themselves, but by sort of taking into consideration all the evidence, and he doesn't even run it through his mind in that moment. It's not like when we're saying, oh yes, England's an island, we are calling to mind every argument we've ever heard for it. It's in the present moment where we're kind of summing or gathering implicitly in our mind all this tacit knowledge that we've accumulated over the years to make an expert judgment in this moment about that particular question, and to do it with certitude. I am not at all insinuating that we are not rational in our certitude. So this is not a blind leap of faith we're making. It is a rational conclusion we do draw to the certitude of the insularity of England. I only mean that we cannot analyze a proof satisfactorily, the result of which good sense actually guarantees to us. So he's saying that it is a rational conclusion that England is an island, and our certainty of that conclusion is indeed rational. But that doesn't mean we're going to be able to lay it out all on the table. That doesn't mean we're going to marshal every single argument, or that even if we could marshal every argument that tends toward its probability, that those arguments in their letter on their own are enough to draw the conclusion. No, no, no. We still need the mind, the educated, the expert mind who knows how to read all the evidence and say, yeah, that's a certain conclusion. Okay, this is a big old quote. Sorry for that. So as an image for this kind of thinking, Newman appeals to something that Newton used in the beginning of his Principia. And Newman will contend that this way of drawing the conclusion, this way of being carried over from probabilities to certainty, is what he calls the illative sense. This sense is operative in everywhere we reason about concrete matters anyway. Also in the sciences and mathematics and of course also history and theology and stuff like that. So it's no surprise that, and I think this is something that Newman does to strengthen his point, it's no surprise to him that he can find an example of this thinking in Newton at the beginning of his Principia. So as an image, Newman offers the method of proof, which is the foundation of modern mathematical science, as contained in the celebrated lemma with which Newman opens his Principia. That is, we know that a regular polygon inscribed in a circle, its sides being continually diminished, tends to become that circle as its limit. But it vanishes before it has coincided with the circle, so that its tendency to be the circle, though ever near fulfillment, never in fact gets beyond a tendency. In like manner, the conclusion is in a real or concrete question is foreseen and predicted rather than actually attained. Foreseen in the number and direction of accumulated premises, which all converge to it, and as the result of their combination, approach it more nearly than any assignable difference, yet do not touch it logically. It is, let me pause there and just look here at the image. So he says you've got a circle inscribed within a polygon, and the more the sides diminish, the more the number of sides increases. So as the polygon expands in its as it gets more sides, the closer the circle approximates to the measure of the polygon. You can see how that works here. So here you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sides, and you see how much gap there is between the circle and the polygon. You get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 sides, and you see how much less of a gap you have between the circle and the polygon. But so long as it's a circle within a polygon, no matter how many sides you add to the polygon, the circle will never lay on top of the polygon. And so there's something insofar as the circle is always approximating it, but never quite achieving it. It is by the strength, variety, or multiplicity of premises, which are only probable, not by invincible syllogisms, by objections overcome, adverse theories neutralized, difficulties gradually clearing up, exceptions proving the rule, unlooked for correlations found with received truths, suspense and delay in the process issuing in triumphant reactions. By all these ways and many others, it is that the practiced and experienced mind is able to make a sure divination that a conclusion is inevitable, of which his lines of reasoning do not actually put him in possession. So the sides are like different premises to the arguments. You can get more and more and more and more of them, but they're never going to put you in possession of the full circle. It's always going to be a polygon, and the circle is not going to overlay the polygon perfectly. But the expert mind can see the trajectory, see where this is going, and make that sure divination that a conclusion is inevitable, of which the lines of reasoning do not actually put him in possession. So as concrete examples of this kind of reasoning, you've got the weather-wise peasant and the diagnosing physician. Newman talks about other examples, but these are two that are perhaps the easiest. So you've got the peasant who can tell you what the weather will be tomorrow, but he can't lay on the table all of his arguments. He knows by the feel, by how things look, by the smell, by the shape of the cloud, by the speed of the wind. Like there's all of these particulars, which he has become sensitive to over years and years and years of practice with this question, such that he can see the circle, which the polygon can't reach. And he can't even give you all the different lines of the polygon, but he can still, by his expertise, make a sure divination of it. Or similarly, a diagnosing physician. Is this, I think, if you talk to any doctor when he's diagnosing, and you get him to kind of be articulate about it, it's not a clean syllogism. It takes an expert judgment. You can't translate that to a machine. And in fact, different physicians can disagree about a diagnosis precisely because of the personal character of this kind of reasoning. These are all instances, Newman says, of a natural capacity or of nature improved by practice and habit, enabling the mind to pass promptly from one set of facts to another. Not only, I say, without conscious media, but without conscious antecedents. So he doesn't even know all of the arguments that are influencing his judgment in that moment. So the judgment is assenting to a truth with certitude, and he can't even lay out on the table all of the arguments he has for it. This sounds a lot like, I hope you've heard it, sounds a lot like Polanyi. And in fact, Newman in chapters 8 and 9 even uses that word tacit. He speaks about tacit understanding. You know, how all the arguments, the evidence we can have for something is not what we can call to mind immediately in the moment. And in our judgments, like the peasant farmer, or like the diagnosing physician, we're relying on an accumulated wealth of experience and knowledge that we can't put out there in the moment. And it's in such a way that we reason, Newman says. It's not by dumping into an abstract syllogism and then letting the ineluctable laws of logic work upon them that we reach certainty. That hangs loose at both ends, namely in the formulation of the premises and in the drawing of the conclusions, which remain only at abstract. And if we're just honest with ourselves, no, we just don't think like that. And we have become certain about so many things, about the insularity of England, about the fact that one day I will die, the fact that I was born, all of these things that we don't have apodictic proof in the sense of a deductive syllogism, we're nevertheless certain of. And it's by this kind of illative sense, this kind of reasoning. It's a faculty of the mind, he says, and it's nothing short of genius. So hopefully that was a helpful introduction to the illative sense, and you will read more fruitfully chapters 8 and 9 and enjoy them. Take care.